editing and publishing. Now, Alice, what's the importance of text publishing for those who don't follow the industry very closely, and why does it matter?
Text is a publisher that has some unusual books in its backlist, especially books in translation. In Australia, it's pretty difficult to make money from books in translation, partly because it's so expensive to produce literary translations. But one of the co-owners of Text, Penny Houston, is a very talented translator. And so as a publisher, they have produced local translations of books such as Nobel Prize winner Patrick Modiano's novels. But another really important thing that Text has done is Text Classics, which is where they have released editions for out-of-print books, including by some of Australia's most celebrated and best authors, such as Thea Astley. And those books would otherwise be pretty difficult and expensive to get a hold of. And they've made it so that they're widely available and quite cheaply too.
Now, you've also got the winners of the Booker Prize, Miles Franklin, Stella. I mean, Text has always had really great titles.
Yes, it's partly because of the concern with literary work that publisher Michael Hayward has, but also there's been a publisher that's interested in publishing debut authors. So Jennifer Down and Claire Wright, both of whom are prize winners, as you mentioned. But Robbie Arnott is another example. They have been the first home for some really celebrated Australian writers.
Now, what's the role of the smaller independent publishers? Is it like what you're saying, bringing the back catalogue, classic Australian literature, new writers? Is that the role that the smaller independents play?
It's not always the case, but it's often the case that independents are operating according to a different drive. So really big commercial publishers, the ultimate decisions that they have to make have to be concerned with the bottom line because their company is owned by shareholders. But for a company such as Text that's privately owned, it means that a lot of their decisions are based on different things other than just the commercial imperative. So for publishers who have a real passion for Australian literature, it means that they're publishing books that may well make a lot, and books that are a kind of, sometimes can be a kind of training ground for authors. So it may be their first book, and there may be an opportunity for that kind of ongoing editorial work that really helps writers develop their craft.
Now, Stone and Pantera are both relatively new publishers. This is an industry that can see publishers come and go. So does it matter if a few of them merge or become, part of larger, global corporations, I suppose?
There's an argument that becoming part of a big international publisher gives the editors working in that house access to different resources that they might not otherwise have. And there's an argument that the Australian authors who are published as part of that merged company might be able to get into international markets. But history shows us that that's not always the case, and that it has happened several times in the past that the merged publisher has, over a period of time, simply been swallowed entirely by the company, and that the imprint no longer exists.
So why are you concerned about these recent acquisitions? There's a bit of a trend with these small publishers going to these global multinational corporations.
Well, as a fan of Australian literature, something that worries me is that there will be fewer opportunities for new authors to find a home for their work. And one of the things that happens, say you're a new author and you have an agent, the agent is pitching the work to different publishing companies. The fewer companies there are, the fewer opportunities there is for an editor to fall in love with a work and publish it. And within houses, the companies don't want to compete against themselves. So in some companies, there will be an either written or unwritten rule that editors within that house can't bid simultaneously on the same book. So it reduces the number of options, which can have a flow-on effect for advances, but also simply for books being picked up altogether.
You mentioned Michael Hayward, the publisher at Text. He said there will be a charter of independence around the imprint, protecting Text's identity within Penguin Random House. Does that address any of your concerns?
It would do if the charter were to be strictly upheld and enforced, but I can't speak to it precisely. I haven't read the charter and I don't know the terms of their agreement. But what the history tells us is that it's just not always as simple as that of carving a business out. And we are talking about businesses here, while I've also used the word literature and I've said that I'm a fan, when it comes down to it, publishing is a business, especially when you're talking about major multinational corporations.
Now, Michael Hayward's told ABC Arts that publishing in Australia has become more challenging due to the increasing costs and the rise of Amazon. How should publishers balance competition in the global market versus the impact on the Australian market?
There are a few ways. The first is that in Australia, literature receives hardly any funding of the total arts budget. So it's really an opportunity for the government to support local culture. One thing people have said is that ebooks significantly reduce costs, but most of the costs associated with creating a book are still there with ebooks. You still have to pay the author and the editor, you still have to pay a designer. So when we're looking at how to save Australian publishers from a similar fate, it's partly support from government, but it's also support from readers. If you love an Australian book, tell a friend.
We alluded there to the role of government. I mean, I discovered as a first-time writer in the last year and a half, 2 years, how underfunded literature is as a kind of like cultural enterprise. What do you think the role of the government is in Australian publishing? Does it do enough to protect the industry, to actually foster a culture where people write and we kind of report back on Australian culture?
Sometimes people have the misperception that writing is cheap or pretty much free. The idea is that you can just do the work on your laptop at home, and so all it costs you is your time. But of course, that's forgetting that time is really expensive and valuable. And so in order to develop literary culture, I mean, an example of a really strong success is the writing culture in Western Sydney. And that didn't happen by accident. That was a combination of work from Western Sydney University, from academics and funding bodies who supported the writers. And so out of that, we have writers such as Michael Muhammad Ahmed and Felicity Castagna, who've gone on to really significant success. But it doesn't happen by accident. It needs the support at the grassroots level.
Alice, thanks for being my guest here on Arts in 30.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Alice Grundy, Managing Editor of Australian Institute Press. Yeah.